There is a moment, almost always quiet, when you begin to notice that something has fallen out of order. It's not a big argument or a serious offense. It's more subtle. Calls that come without asking. Decisions others make using your time, your money, or your patience as if they were still endless. And you, who have lived long enough to know that nothing is endless, start to feel an uneasiness you can't quite name. How far does your responsibility as a father or mother go when your children are already adults? At what point does helping stop being love and start becoming wear and tear? Maybe you tell yourself it's normal, that this is just what being a parent is like, that it will pass. Or maybe you tell yourself you don't want conflict, that it's not worth making things uncomfortable now. But something inside you tightens, a mix of guilt, exhaustion, and the bitter feeling of giving up your own ground. I've been there, not as theory, but as lived experience. As a man who no longer has the energy he once did, who values his quiet mornings, his routines, his silence, and who understands that dignity isn't lost all at once, it's handed over in small, poorly thought-out concessions. My name is Gabriel, and this is the Stoic Garden. What follows are 7 inner shifts, 7 practical decisions inspired by the philosophy of the ancient Stoics that helped me set boundaries with my adult children without living trapped in guilt or remorse. Not to break bonds, but to put them in order. Not to harden the heart, but to inhabit it again with respect. And before we move on, I want you to sit with this question without answering it just yet. What are you allowing today that deep down you already know you shouldn't keep allowing? 1. Defining where my responsibility ends and theirs begins. There is a very common confusion that settles in without asking permission when children grow up. It doesn't happen overnight. It's slow, almost imperceptible. One day you keep solving things because you always have, because you know how to do it better, because it comes naturally. And when you finally notice you're no longer accompanying, you're carrying. Not because of external obligation, but because of an internal idea you never questioned in time. The idea that you are still responsible for everything that happens to them, even when they are already adults, making their own decisions. I had to sit down with myself one ordinary afternoon in silence, with the house in order and my body tired, and ask myself an uncomfortable question. Not a nice question, but one that scrapes a bit on the inside. What am I still holding up that no longer corresponds to me by age, by role, and by reality? It wasn't easy to answer because love, fear, and an old habit of feeling needed were all mixed into that question. But something more honest also appeared. The exhaustion of invading and of letting myself be invaded. Defining where your responsibility ends is not a cold or selfish act. It's an act of clarity. A parent's responsibility changes over time, just as the body and energy change. When your children are adults, your duty is no longer to prevent every mistake or cushion every fall. Your duty is not to stand in the way of them taking responsibility for their own lives. And that hurts more than many admit, because it forces you to let go of a role that gave meaning to your daily life for years. I remember a friend my age, retired with a fragile back and just enough spirit to get by, who was still solving his son's financial problems as if he were 40 years younger. He complained about stress, insomnia, a tense body, but when I asked him what would happen if he said enough, he fell silent. It wasn't fear that his son would suffer. It was fear of no longer being indispensable. That's when something hit me hard. Sometimes we confuse responsibility with attachment to a role that has already completed its cycle. From Stoicism, I learned to look at this boundary with more sobriety. Epictetus spoke about clearly distinguishing what depends on us and what does not as theory, but as mental hygiene. The life of an adult child no longer depends on you, even if it's hard to accept. Your decisions, your time, your energy, and your inner peace do depend on you. When you mix those two things up, you lose both. You help poorly, and you wear yourself down in silence. There's a simple tool you can use, almost like a daily exercise. Before accepting a burden, a request, or someone else's urgency, pause briefly and honestly ask yourself whether this is your responsibility or a natural consequence of decisions someone else needs to learn to carry. It's not about automatically saying no. It's about responding from the right place, not from guilt or from fear of disappointing. I want to leave you thinking about this before we move on. If today you're still taking on responsibilities that no longer belong to you, you're not only taking peace away from yourself, you're also delaying your children's growth. That's an uncomfortable truth to face, but one that changes everything when you finally dare to look at it. 2. Holding the boundary without justifying or over-explaining. One of the most common traps when you start setting boundaries is believing you have to explain them to exhaustion, as if the boundary were only valid if the other person understands it, accepts it, and approves of it. I fell into that too. I said no, but wrapped it in arguments, apologies, unnecessary clarifications, and the more I talked, the more insecure I felt. Because deep down, I wasn't setting a boundary, I was asking permission to set it. Over the years, I understood something that was hard for me to accept at first. When a boundary is fair, it doesn't need defending. Excessive explanation doesn't come from kindness, it comes from guilt. And guilt is fertile ground for emotional manipulation, even without bad intentions. An adult child quickly learns where to push when they sense that your no isn't firm on the inside. Not because they're cruel, but because they're human, and because you yourself left that door open. I remember a simple domestic scene. An afternoon when my routine was set, my body tired, the day nearing its end. A call comes in asking for something that wasn't urgent, but was demanding. I said I couldn't. And then I started justifying myself. That I was tired, that I had to get up early the next day, that it wasn't a good time. On the other end, silence first, insistence after. I understood too late that every explanation was a crack through which the boundary weakened. Holding a boundary without justifying yourself isn't about being cold or distant. It's about being clear, saying no calmly, without raising your voice, without long speeches. Sometimes a single sentence is enough. I can't do it. It doesn't work for me, not today, and then staying quiet. That silence is uncomfortable, especially at first, because it forces you to face the other person's reaction without the shield of words. But it also gives something valuable back to you: inner authority. Seneca warned that those who don't govern their words end up being governed by them. I understood that late, but I understood it. Talking too much is often an elegant way of backing down. When you keep your response sober, the message organizes itself. The other person may get upset, may not understand, may insist. That's no longer under your control. The only thing that belongs to you is not betraying yourself in the attempt to please. There's a practical tool that works better than it seems. Decide your boundary before the conversation, not during it. If you enter the dialogue without having defined it, emotional pressure pushes you to negotiate with yourself. When the boundary is already clear inside, the words come out simply, without ornament, not as an attack, but as a calm statement. Let me leave you with a question that isn't comfortable, but is necessary. How many times do you say no, but you say it in a way that actually sounds like maybe? Because as long as that keeps happening, the conflict doesn't get resolved, it only gets postponed. And later it always comes back heavier, comes back. 3. Separating love from constant permission. One of the most painful confusions for a parent is believing that loving means giving in. We don't always think it consciously, but we act it out. We allow small acts of disrespect, poorly framed demands, invasions of time that aren't urgent, because deep down we tell ourselves we're doing it out of love. I told myself that for years, until I understood that this misunderstood love was eroding something deeper, mutual respect. There's a scene that repeats itself in many homes of people our age. You've already organized your day, maybe you got up early, did your things calmly, took care of your body as best you can, and just when you're about to rest, an outside demand appears that doesn't consider your rhythm or your fatigue, and you give in. Not because you want to, but because you don't want to seem distant, harsh, or selfish. That gesture, repeated over time, doesn't strengthen the bond. It weakens it. Separating love from constant permission requires a maturity that doesn't always come on its own. Loving an adult child doesn't mean always being available or accepting any kind of treatment. Affection isn't measured by how many concessions you make, but by the quality of the bond you maintain. When you allow everything, the implicit message is dangerous. You say without words that your boundaries don't matter, that your time is secondary, that your life can wait. Marcus Aurelius wrote to remind himself that no one can degrade you without your consent. He didn't say it from pride, but from responsibility. I read that today and bring it into this territory. No one can treat you without respect if you don't cooperate with that disorder. And sometimes, cooperating means staying silent when you should set a boundary, or conceding when you know inside that it doesn't belong. I remember a difficult conversation I had with one of my children. There were no shouts or reproaches, just a clear sentence said in a calm voice. "I love you, but I'm not going to allow this anymore." The silence that followed was heavy. I felt guilt, of course. I felt fear that I was breaking something, but over time, the opposite happened. The bond reorganized itself. It wasn't immediate or comfortable, but it was more honest. There's a simple tool that can help you begin. Every time you're about to say yes, ask yourself whether you're doing it out of love or out of fear of losing affection. The answer usually comes quickly, even if we don't like it. Saying no when it's appropriate doesn't cool the bond, it cleans it, and a clean bond withstands the passage of time better. I want to leave you with this idea without closing it completely. When you confuse love with constant permission, you don't only wear yourself down, you also deprive your children of learning how to relate to an adult who respects themselves. And that lesson, even if it's uncomfortable, is one of the most sober gifts you can still offer. 4. Accepting the initial discomfort as part of the process. There's a part of setting boundaries that almost no one talks about honestly, the discomfort, that dull uneasiness that appears after saying no, not during, but after. When you hang up the phone, when the door closes, when silence returns to the house, and you're left alone with your thoughts. Many people backtrack there, not because the boundary was wrong, but because the body and emotions protest. I learned late that this discomfort is not a sign of error. It's a sign of change. For years you trained others, without saying it, to relate to you in a certain way. When you change that, the system resists. Just as the body resists when you start using forgotten muscles. It hurts, but it doesn't injure. Confusing pain with damage is one of the great traps of this stage of life. I remember one particular night. I had said no to something I had always accepted before. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent. I went to bed with my stomach tight and my head full of questions. Was I too harsh? Am I becoming selfish? What if they pull away? I slept poorly that night. But the next morning, something was different. Not outside, inside. A strange calm, fragile, but real. Like standing upright again after a long time, hunched over. Accepting the initial discomfort means understanding that not every conflict is a threat. Sometimes it's a sign that you're stopping the betrayal of yourself. Stoicism helped me look at these sensations without dramatizing them. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that it's not events that disturb us, but the judgments we make about them. Discomfort isn't the enemy. The enemy is running from it without understanding it. There's a common scene in later life that makes this worse. The body no longer responds the same way. Rest becomes more necessary. Energy is a finite resource. When you decide to protect that, someone will inevitably feel frustrated. If every time someone is uncomfortable you retreat, the message is clear. Your well-being always comes last. And living like that over the years comes with a cost in the form of silent resentment. A practical tool I recommend is simple, but it requires inner discipline. When you feel guilt or discomfort after setting a boundary, don't act immediately to relieve it. Don't call to over-explain. Don't soften the boundary in the heat of the moment. Give it a day. Observe the sensation like you would observe the weather. It passes. It always passes. And when it does, the boundary is usually firmer than before. I want to leave you with a warning that isn't meant to scare you, but to bring order. If you backtrack every time discomfort appears, you train your environment to press exactly there. And without realizing it, you end up living on the defensive, tired, and confused. Initial discomfort is the price of recovered dignity. It's not comfortable, but it's temporary. What isn't temporary is the life you build when you decide not to keep paying that price. 5. Keeping coherence between what I say and what I allow. There's something the years have taught me more clearly than any book. Words carry little weight when they aren't backed by actions. You can explain your boundaries calmly, you can express yourself respectfully, but if you later allow the opposite, the real message isn't what you say, it's what you tolerate. And adult children, even if they don't always admit it, understand that very well. Incoherence rarely comes from bad intentions. It comes from exhaustion. You say no, then you soften. You draw a line, then you cross it to avoid an argument. And so, without realizing it, the boundary becomes blurry. It doesn't disappear all at once. It wears down, like a poorly maintained fence that at first is still visible, but over time no longer stops anyone. I remember a period when I myself fell into that back and forth. One day I affirmed one thing, and the next day I did another. I justified it by saying it was for peace, for harmony, for not complicating things. But deep down, I knew I was paying a high price. I lived in constant tension, waiting for the next demand, the next test. There was no real rest when you contradict yourself. From a Stoic perspective, coherence isn't rigidity, it's inner alignment. Seneca spoke about the value of living in accordance with what one considers right, not with what is comfortable in the moment. When what you say and what you do match, something falls into place, not only outside, but inside, and that inner order is felt even without words. In later life, this coherence becomes even more important. The body signals more quickly when something isn't right. Stress shows up faster, insomnia comes easily, the mood suffers. Many of those signals don't come from big problems, but from small daily betrayals of your own limits. Allowing what you said you wouldn't allow is more exhausting than any physical effort. There's a practical tool that can help you sustain this coherence. Review your boundaries as commitments to yourself, not to others. If a boundary is broken once, observe it without punishing yourself, but correct it immediately. Not with reproaches, but with actions. Coherence isn't explained, it's demonstrated. I want to leave you with a tension worth holding. Every time you allow something that contradicts what you said, you teach others how to treat you, not with speeches, but with examples. And even if respect doesn't always return immediately, lack of coherence almost never goes unnoticed. In the long run, it always leaves a mark. 6. Stopping the negotiation of my time, my money, and my energy. There's a stage in life when you begin to understand something with a clarity you didn't have before. Your resources no longer renew themselves on their own. Time doesn't stretch. Energy doesn't appear through enthusiasm. And money, when it comes late, hurts more to lose. And yet many parents continue to negotiate these 3 pillars as if we were still in midlife, as if wear and tear didn't count. I did it too. I lent time when I was already tired. I gave money to avoid tension. I gave away emotional energy I didn't have to spare, not out of conscious generosity, but out of inertia, because it had always been that way, because saying enough seemed more costly than continuing to give in, until the body started speaking louder than the mind. Insomnia, irritability, a persistent feeling of being drained. There's a very common scene you might recognize. You're at home, with your routine adjusted, protecting your schedules because you already know how hard it is to recover. And suddenly, a demand appears that dismantles everything, a favor that isn't urgent, a financial request that isn't accompanied by responsibility, an emotional requirement that leaves you exhausted for days, and you accept, not because you can, but because you don't know how to refuse without feeling guilty. From Stoicism, I learned to look at these resources as finite goods entrusted to me, not as endless reserves at the service of others. It's not hardness, it's realism. Epictetus insisted that no one can harm you without your consent. I add something from experience. Many times, harm enters disguised as poorly managed goodwill. There's a concrete tool that can help you bring order to this without unnecessary confrontations. Define in advance how much time, how much money, and how much energy you are willing to offer, and under what conditions. Don't negotiate it in the heat of the moment. Don't redefine it under emotional pressure. When those margins are clear, saying no stops being a rejection and becomes a simple reference to an already established limit. Let me share something that was hard for me to accept. When you keep giving more than you can, you don't become more generous. You become dependent on other people's gratitude. And when that gratitude doesn't come, resentment appears. That's a silent bill that gets expensive with the years. I want to leave you with a question that deserves time. What part of your current exhaustion doesn't come from age, but from having negotiated too much of what you could no longer afford to lose? Because as long as that answer isn't faced head-on, the wear and tear continues, even if the names of the demands change. 7. Accepting that my role now is that of an adult parent, not a savior. There comes a moment in life when continuing to be the savior stops being a virtue and starts being an obstacle. I don't say it harshly, I say it from lived exhaustion. For many years, saving was part of the role, solving, anticipating, cushioning blows. But when children are already adults, that automatic reflex begins to disorder the bond. Not because love is lacking, but because intervention is excessive. I had to recognize something I wasn't proud of. Sometimes I helped, not because it was necessary, but because it calmed me. It gave me a sense of control, of usefulness, of still having a central place. But that place was no longer real. It was an artificial extension of a role that had already served its purpose. Accepting that was uncomfortable. Letting it go, even more so. The savior figure is seductive, especially in later life. When other areas of life shrink, when work is behind you, when the body no longer responds the same way, being indispensable to a child can feel like an anchor. But it's a false anchor, because it ties you to problems that aren't yours and takes away their opportunity to face their own reality with maturity. I remember a conversation with a man my age, also a father, who lived putting out other people's fires, a child's work problems, relationship conflicts, financial disorder. There was always an emergency. There was always something to solve. When I asked him what would happen if he stopped intervening, he looked at me as if I were talking about abandonment. That's when I understood how deep this misunderstanding runs. Not saving is not abandoning. It's respecting the other person's process. From a Stoic perspective, accepting one's role is a form of practical wisdom. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that everything has its time and its function. The adult parent is not the one who rescues, but the one who supports from the right distance. Present, but not absorbing. Available, but not captured. Firm, but not invasive. There's a simple tool that can help you navigate this change. Before intervening, ask yourself whether your help strengthens or weakens the other person, whether it relieves a moment or postpones a necessary lesson. The answer won't always be clear, but the very act of asking the question already changes the quality of your action. I want to leave you with this open tension, because it isn't resolved all at once. When you let go of the savior role, something hurts. A familiar identity is lost, but something else is gained, quieter and more valuable. The possibility of an adult bond, more sober, more respectful, not always immediate, not always comfortable, but much more true. At this point, you may notice something different, not because everything is resolved, but because the map is now clearer. We talked about real responsibility, not one inherited by inertia, about holding boundaries without over-explaining, about separating love from constant permission, about accepting initial discomfort without running from it, about living with coherence, about protecting your time, your money, and your energy, and finally, about letting go of the savior role to assume that of an adult parent, not as theory, but as a possible way of life. If I had to leave you with a single reflection, it would be this. Setting boundaries doesn't distance you from your children, it brings you back to yourself. And when a parent returns to their center, something in the bond changes, even if it's uncomfortable at first. Dignity isn't negotiated without consequences, and you're still in time to live this stage with respect, calm, and a serene authority that doesn't need to impose itself. My name is Gabriel, and this is the Stoic Garden, a space for men and women who have lived long enough not to deceive themselves anymore and who want to age with sovereignty, not resignation. If this message accompanied you, share it with someone who needs it. Subscribe so we can keep walking together. Leave me the phrase, "I am Stoic," along with the country you're listening from in the comments. I read every message, and it matters to me to know from which corner of the world this sober and conscious community is growing. 2 videos will appear on the screen next that can help you continue bringing order to this stage of life. Choose one and continue. We'll be here.